No, this is the part where it's not. Oh, there it is. Right? And we're live. It is Thursday, September 10th, 2020, 5:03 p.m., except that YouTube is telling me I'm not live, except I don't believe it. I think I am live. If
I'll
you're
check.
watching on YouTube,
Oh,
and we are not live, then you can't see this, but I just don't believe this. Um,
Fake news.
So
Fake
I'm going to
news.
assume I'm live.
Okay.
It's 5:03 p.m., and I just want to tell you guys I have had a day of just unparalleled incompetence, all on my
Your
part.
incompetence?
Cool.
Yes, I woke up at 8:05, having done the thing that I never do, which is oversleep. My first
8:05 is
meeting of the morning-
oversleeping?
Yeah, because I had a meeting at 8 in person with, turns out to be a very tolerant person, who was waiting there in the rain for me, because of course you can't have coffee indoors anymore. So poor Mayal Sadani was waiting in the rain. Then I found out on the walk home that in working out yesterday on my rowing machine barefoot, I had sufficiently chewed up my feet that I couldn't tell if it was more painful to walk with shoes or without them. I ended up walking home without shoes. I think it was the right call, but I'm not sure. And then on the way home, I found out that because of a time zone error, and by which I mean I forgot what time zone I was in, I had missed a call with a funder. And so,
but Ben, you don't
within
believe in time zones.
I don't, which does not help me when the funders do. And so, within an hour of waking up, I had already blown it 3 times, and it has just gone on from there. And I was walking around Emily Bazelon's old neighborhood in D.C. And so you are, it is cool to have Emily Bazelon here, because when we are not allowed to have fun anymore, and this is the 168th day in a row in which Kate and I have not been allowed to have fun, it is good, at least in lieu of fun, to have Emily Bazelon with us. Welcome to the show, Emily.
Well, thank you. I can't wait to really experience your no good, very bad, terrible, horrible day with you.
Well, what was your most incompetent thing that you managed to do today?
The most incompetent thing I did today?
Yeah, because I don't want to feel like, I just feel like people should tell me their most incompetent things so that I feel a little
Does it
better.
have to be today? Let's open it up to this week.
Yeah, that's totally
Okay.
legitimate. I'm just trying to think. I mean, I usually have so many examples of that. Oh, I had to tape the podcast I do, as you know, the Slate Political Gabfest this morning, and I've been taping it at home for months now, and I mistaped it. Like, I made a recording that was useless, and our producer had to use the Zoom backup recording instead. That seems like
So how did you do that? Like,
So
what was the,
I have-
what was the,
I
'cause we have podcast fails sometimes. It's like one of the creatures of the remote life is that every now and then you get a really important person on, and that is always when the podcast fails, and you end up having to like re-record it or something. So what happened today with your podcast fail?
So I think I have a Zoom recorder, not Zoom, remote learning Zoom, but like that's it. And it has a button that you press when you're using the external versus the internal mic. And then you can see in the counter whether it's recording or not. And I pressed the wrong thing and somehow like didn't realize it. I looked at the counter. Anyway, I'm not really sure what I screwed up, but I know it was that feature because it's very poorly labeled.
And why do you guys not use Zencaster on the Gabfest?
Good question. I don't know the answer.
Good question. I love Zencaster. I was going to say I did this. So this is a long time, well, not that long ago, but like 9 months ago, I was at Facebook during like my being embedded, and I must have taped 130 hours of interviews. And the interesting thing that I kind of found, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, Emily, was I was embedded and I could tape all of my interviews and there was no NDA. But I had like at some point the New Yorker gave me this huge honking giant like thing that I would set on the table, and everyone shut the fuck up. Like no one would talk if they could like see the microphone like on the table. And so I tried it at one thing. It totally changed the entire tone of my entire time there. And I was like, okay, this is just not gonna. And I went back to taping on my iPhone. But I had forgotten to put it into airplane mode, and my dad called in the middle of this one conversation.
And then that shuts the recording off.
It just shuts the recording off. Yeah. And so it ended up being an hour and a half discussion that was like super interesting about like the removal clause and like the removal clause of this one thing and like all of the constitutional implications of like what you do when something like this happens and I picked up my phone and I had stopped taking notes because I was like, I want to be in this interview and like be like responding and not like taking notes. And I picked up my phone and I was like, oh. Anyways, it's
the worst feeling ever. It's like
the worst.
Nightmare. Yeah.
Yeah. It was awful.
I will give you a Zoom recorder nightmare that will like bother you. So when Susan and I released our book, we shortly thereafter went into lockdown, and so Terry Gross wanted to do an interview, and they couldn't figure out how to do two remote sites. So Susan, who has small children anyway, just said, okay, you do it. So I did this with Terry Gross on my Zoom recorder at home, and there was only one problem. It worked fine, except for one thing, which is that the line of my microphone started picking up the radio, which had never happened before and has never happened since. So if you listen to my interview with Terry Gross, you will hear music playing in the background, and it is not music that is playing either in her studio or my house. It is actually FM radio being picked up on the microphone line being a kind of antenna. And so whatever system you use for remote podcasting, there are failure mechanisms available. And I think we should all thank the other Zoom for backing up
my great wisdom,
Gabfest.
Whatever it was. It was pretty dumb though. I mean, come on, like we've been doing this for months and I've been doing it successfully. And so I must have been just a little like debonair this morning. I don't know. Debonair's not
anyway.
All right.
Cavalier.
Emily Bazelon, I want to talk to you. I want to start with your...
Wait, we haven't even introduced Emily properly.
Emily doesn't really need
I'm a journalist.
I know. She doesn't really need an introduction. It's true. Emily is awesome.
One of the three voices of the Slate Political Gabfest. She is a features writer on criminal justice, Supreme Court, not so much Supreme Court stuff anymore these days for the New York Times Magazine. A lot of criminal justice.
She's a legal reporter.
A lot of law, a lot of legal system-y stuff for the New York Times Magazine. She is a former neighbor in the AU Park neighborhood of Washington, D.C., resident of and lecturer at the Yale Law School, resident of New Haven, lecturer at the Yale Law School, and all-around cool and excellent person.
That's good. I'll take that. That's great.
You're pretty okay. So we like you here.
I want to start with your... When on the Gabfest last week, when David Plotz asked you for your cocktail chatter, asked you what you were thinking about, you described drinking away your thoughts about election nightmares, and that you've been spending all your time like ruminating about all the ways the elections can go bad. And so I just want to clear the decks of this right off the bat and say, what are your top three election nightmare scenarios?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Weighted for realism.
For
like my top
Aren't they
one
the
is that
same
Trump
for all
wins.
of it?
You know,
Yeah.
which is
I was like,
no, but I mean, like, I don't mean like that the election goes a different way than you want. I mean that the election system fails. So with, like, what's the most horrible situations that you think are most likely?
So
just to be cheerful about it.
Yeah, I'm a nuts and bolts person about the election process, and I'm very focused on the events leading up to the election. There are also things that can go wrong after the voting, but I'm very focused on the voting. And so what I'm worried about is mass voter suppression in one form or another. And that could be a result of lack of preparation and addressing coronavirus. So we could have cities where there aren't enough polling places open and we have really long lines, and that hinders lots of people from voting. I tend to get obsessed with the city I grew up in, Philadelphia, on this score, though they just got a bunch of money for hiring more poll workers and opening polling places. So that made me feel a little better. I'm also really worried about people voting by mail for the first time and not doing it quite right. If you don't sign the ballot exactly right, if you return it in the wrong place, if you don't return it early enough that the post office has time to return it, that's a potential problem. And then there's litigation going on, especially in swing states, that could limit the number of drop-off boxes, so the opportunities that people have to return ballots that don't depend on the Postal Service. And then there's this whole question of counting, right? So in a number of swing states, including Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin, by law, election officials cannot open the ballots until they cannot open the mail-in ballots until Election Day. That means they can't count them in advance. And so if we have an election in which the method of voting is different for the different parties, in other words, Democrats vote more by mail and Republicans vote more in person, we could have the appearance of exit polls and preliminary results on election night that heavily favor President Trump. And then we could have that overtaken by a kind of blue wave of Democratic votes for Joe Biden. But there'll be this time delay. And, Trump seems like he's very interested in sowing distrust. And that kind of time delay would play into his hands, even though it would have nothing to do with the outcome, really. It would only have to do with the sort of the theater of the immediate aftermath of the election.
Yeah.
How's that?
I think that's actually really a perfect encapsulation of my greatest fear. Like, I think that it plays out forever and it becomes like some type of Goffman, like the appearance of reality becomes reality type of like psycho, no truth is truth universe, and we don't have anything and nothing has meaning. So that's dark.
I mean, it's very Russian, right? It's sort of the idea that what you do is you just destabilize people's belief in information. And that's the way you maintain power and control.
So I don't actually believe this. But
good. What part of this? Tell us why to be optimistic then.
Well, I want to try to argue that the situation is not that dire. I actually think the situation is pretty upsetting and scary, but let's red team that a little bit. There's gonna be some degree of red mirage, blue shift. So what? The media has actually done a pretty good job preparing people for this. Every network, except maybe Fox, I don't know what Fox is going to do, is going to spend election night saying, these numbers coming in, reflect only the election day vote. We're not going to be, we're still calling, the numbers that you see don't include the 60% of the votes that were cast by mail, and those are going to be coming in over the next few days or even the next week. So we still consider this state too close to call. All of the networks, including Fox especially, Fox has an excellent decision desk, are not going to be calling states based on these preliminary numbers. And so the president can say, I mean, I suppose he could even go out and declare victory without the network saying he's got 270 electoral votes. But that's kind of like what he does every day, which is, you know, he says he's the greatest president. He's done the most for black people since anybody except maybe Abraham Lincoln. I don't know a whole lot of black people who believe that or who take that all that seriously. And so why, you know, to what extent is this an election problem or an election administration problem? And to what extent is it a Donald Trump problem?
What do you think the Republicans will do if it plays out in the way you've suggested? I mean, I think we should bracket Fox and what its role is, because I'm really glad you reminded me about its decision desk, and you know, it's rigorous about polls. It
has a really good polling group. It's really odd that they haven't fired it yet, but
right.
They haven't.
But what happens when Sean Hannity's on the air, or Tucker Carlson? Like, do they stick with that news reporting, or do they run an interview with President Trump in which he declares victory? And if they do the latter, what effect does that have on the Republicans in Washington?
So I don't know, right? And I think that's like, I wonder if what we have is an election administration problem, or whether what we have is we don't trust the Republican elected officials, starting with the president, but not limited to the president, to behave in a responsible fashion and not to declare victory before the votes are counted, and to try to rally people into a state of fever and perhaps violence, which, you know, let's be honest, they're not above, in order to put pressure on state and local officials to disqualify certain ballots, count certain things, act very quickly and precipitously. But we are operating in a state law environment that's very specific state to state. These elections aren't certified until the votes are counted. And so I guess part of me says, okay, I totally agree with you that we should all be really afraid of the way the president is going to behave and how much influence he's going to have over Republican officials. But that's a different question from whether state and local officials are going to count votes reasonably and fairly and certify the election results as they in fact exist. Now, there's a million technical problems that may arise, and that's a separate set of issues that may influence that. But I guess I do think that I have more confidence in the sort of automaticity of the system to count the votes and declare the right winner than I do in Donald Trump not to preempt that process by talking out of his ass. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I totally think that you're right that those two things are separate. I think what I worry about is more of a sort of, it's less dramatic. Like, I mean, it could be there'll be violence in the streets and that'll be super scary, but the United States doesn't tend to, right? Like, we tend to have much more like corrosive democratic problems. So, you know, imagine something like the 2000 election in which you have problems with the count in one state. If that happens and all the focus goes to that one state and it's decisive, it will almost certainly be a state in which because this is always true, the state election laws like don't have tons of details in them. They tend to leave some things up in the air in a way that is precarious. I mean, this is something that election law experts have been warning about for a long time. And so then you could very well have a situation in which the lawyers converge. And, you know, whatever you want to say about 2000, there was that kind of moment where, you know, Bush's lawyers converging in this physical group had some impact on the process and the count. Then there's just like the way in which the litigation starts to run up against the deadlines for declaring who the electors are. And then there's just like the possibility of gumming up the works. And especially with absentee ballots, there's a lot of legal maneuvering that can go into counting them that can just take a long time, right? You can call for a recount, you can challenge every single ballot. Like, that sucked in 2000, and we had two much more traditional candidates, right, who basically weren't going to like upend the whole democracy.
Yeah.
Quick question on that, and then I'll let Kate take over. Do you have the sense? So I have the sense that happened only because there was one swing state, right? And that if you have a situation, 2016 was an extremely close election, but Trump won 3 critical swing states, and so there was no dispute about any of them. If you have one key state, you're going to litigate every ballot. But if you have 4 swing states, you don't litigate any of the ballots.
Really? Why? Why do you feel so confident about
that?
Because you have to flip all 4 in order to...
What if they're all close, or they're just not done?
But
you send your lawyers to all of them.
Interesting. So you think you wouldn't make the calculation, we have a 35-40% chance of winning in each state over 4 states, that's vanishingly small, screw it? You think there's a, burn the fields, bitter ender quality to that situation where there's 4 swing states and they're all really close?
I mean, I think it's certainly possible, right? I think it is. What I want the most is for Trump to find a way to spin defeat as victory. If indeed he loses, like if he wins, then he wins. I don't mean
so
to be
generous of you.
I
want him to eat defeat as defeat.
Yeah,
like,
and I want him to
doing that.
I want him to taste every bitter.
We're having a process of democracy conversation, Ben. If he wins, he wins. Like, that's how it goes. Then he wins. If he loses, though, if it's not super apparent that he loses, I think that he could try to mount the kinds of challenges we're talking about, and I think he'll have the Justice Department behind him, right? I mean, I don't think Bill Barr is going to refrain. He's not going to be like reining in influence, and that's why I asked you what you think the Republicans in the Senate and in the House will do, because I think that's where, look, I mean, I feel kind of silly saying this, but like that's where you need norms to matter to Washington.
Why do you feel silly talking about norms? That's like my bread and butter, Emily. Like, who cares about
I don't
law?
know, Kate. I don't know why do I feel silly. Talking about it in terms of the Republicans in the Senate and expecting them to uphold these norms feels a little bit like
that is silly. But like norms themselves are not silly necessarily. But yes, I think that
I feel like a fool every time I say the word norms these days. Because because
they're so important, though. Kate's right. Like, they're really important.
I know,
they just aren't working out very well.
I walked into the Trump administration, saying all these things about the norms of the presidency, and I feel like such an idiot. It's like lecturing, like,
why?
Why? You know what I feel like? I feel like an abstinence-only education. Sex ed person in a high school. Like the students are fucking laughing at us.
Yeah. No, I mean, like to give you some okay, I'm gonna run with that metaphor, Ben. Thank you so much for that. But it's like yes, norms are like these nice soft things, but like it turns out that the fucking rule of law didn't serve us very well either. We had an entire impeachment process that like ended up not kind of like doing it. Like there's all of these like procedures and various types of things, and if like you can't get people to act in keeping with certain types of norms, and if you don't get them to have normative values that are have norms that underlie the values that kind of like the law is like the interstitial for, like I just don't really see. Sorry, I'm just like so Bob Ellickson on this, and I'm probably more Bob Ellickson than Bob Ellickson. But there's just like
Bob Ellickson lives a few blocks away from me and has his office across the hall, so I feel very happy that
he's the best, man. I love him so much. He's so good. Anyways, but we could get into a whole property law thing and how I think it's super relevant to these discussions. But I won't. I will just say that I was going to say that Rick Pildes from NYU was on last week, and Nate personally at Stanford has been on a few times, and it's fascinating to kind of hear the things that they're both kind of deciding to concentrate on. I think of them as both very smart and very kind of savvy people. And Rick, interestingly, his like cause d'etre for like for the fall going into election is to get people to vote in person. I think specifically to avoid the type of maelstrom that you're describing, Emily, of like this just going and that it goes on forever. It's infinite. Like, you know, you, as Ben said, you hit 4 swing states and you analyze every signature to see if it's legitimate and like, you know, everything else. So that's like kind of one solution. And then like Nate is an interesting thing where he's trying to get poll workers out so that people can come to polls and like trust that they can be in person, and also working on basically ensuring like the people trust the postal service and absentee ballots, because traditionally marginalized communities do not trust the postal service and think that they are throwing away their vote if they put it into a post office box, and so they won't vote. So like, is it better? Like it's kind of too interesting. They have like, it's interesting. I can't tell if like Nate and like Rick, even though they're like have co-authored before and are like friends, are like working against each other, because I feel like Rick is like, if you like vote in person, if you can vote in person, and Nate is like, but you should also trust absentee voting and the entire process of not voting in person. And so I can't tell which is more reality based. And in the last 2 days, Ben Ginsburg of 2000, one of the attorneys for the Bush v. Gore, representing Bush at the time, like came out and kind of had this really lovely op-ed that he wrote. Where is it, in the Atlantic? I can't remember. But it basically said that like, it basically was like that there was this, that like Republicans should rally behind exactly what you're saying, Emily. Republicans should rally around this idea that like there should be a rule of law and we should be like committed to the principles. And there was also, I think in the Atlantic, an article that said that going to vote was as dangerous as going to the grocery store. And so I kind of think that like, I kind of like that we're fighting the battle on both fronts, but I'm really, really, really hoping that it's not undermining us in some way. Does that make any sense? Like, I don't know, like what your thought is on that. Like, well, do you think that we should have just picked one or over the other?
I think you're totally right that the messaging hasn't become one. So, and this was true at the Democratic National Convention, right? Like Michelle Obama said, vote in person if you can. And I think that people like Rick Pildes, and I put Jed Sugarman, who's at Fordham, in this camp, like they look at all of the things we've been talking about and they want to encourage people to vote in person, sort of no matter, like if they possibly can, maybe. And I think Nate's point is that when you look at what people say they're going to do, we're at like, depending on which survey, it's between 50 and 40% of the country says they plan to vote by mail. So if you undermine that and make people think no, that's a lot of people. Like, huh? So I think when you think about this in terms of enfranchisement, we must and we should be able to hold a safe and fair election where we can do all of those things. And yet, if you're being completely a realist about this issue of counting and tabulating and signature verification, it does look like voting in person, if you can do it, is the way to go. And so I think one thing that I think Nate has been emphasizing lately is the importance of early voting and how in a lot of, right, like a lot of swing states vote, right. So, right. And so like that makes a big difference. Now, I will point out, however, that Pennsylvania has not previously had early voting, and it's county dependent right now, as far as I know. And Pennsylvania's a little confusing because there's litigation going on from both Republicans and Democrats. But my understanding is right now, some counties are having early in-person voting and some are not. Like Philadelphia is, I believe, if I'm correct. And so that makes a big difference, and like really clear information about that makes a difference. But if they've never done it before, the chances that the whole get out to vote operation on either side is going to be prepared to fully take advantage of it and that everyone's going to believe it's there right? Like that's a lot to ask because people.
You're completely right. No,
like
you're
that's a
completely
lot.
right.
Like yeah. So I
it's like
feel
not the time for experimentation. It's the time that people want to trust their vote more than ever. Yet we are in this kind of inescapable moment of experimentation in which like we're testing these systems in ways that like this was not the election that I would have wanted to do this for. But
right. And when you talk to the vote by mail experts,
on the other hand, I do think that there's a important countervailing factor, which is, so if you look at poll data about people's intent to vote, people really want to vote this election to numbers that are different from prior years. And I do think that matters. Like, you know, yes, there is lots of methods of voter suppression, some of which are intentional and some of which are incidental to circumstance. But they, you know, the question of whether they are counterbalanced meaningfully by the fact that people are like actually do seem to understand that the election matters and that they do seem to respond negatively to having their vote suppressed, which I want to say is the single most encouraging thing in the entire Trump administration, just in terms of the other than the response of certain civil servants, just the fact that, you know, people are not idiots. And, you know, if you
speak for yourself, Ben.
You know,
sorry.
Well, yeah, I mean, other than me. I mean, that if you make systematic efforts to suppress people's votes, they do figure out what you're doing, and they do tell people about it. And that does actually, and there's a lot of data on this, increase people's desire to and energy level associated with voting. And I don't know, I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And you're totally right. I mean, you saw this in Alabama with the Doug Jones election. There was, right, like a lot of voter suppression, and people were like, hey, this is my precious right. Don't take it away from me. Like if you threaten something, it makes it seem more precious, and then people exercise it. There's totally something to what you're saying.
And it's funny. Yeah. You know, it's funny. I got I mean, talking about your conversation with cab drivers is the biggest cliche in journalism, and so I don't want to.
You're turning into Tom Friedman as we speak.
Right. But you know, I actually had a conversation with an Uber driver who that really made an impression on me. She was a middle-aged African American woman, and you know, we were just chatting about the election, and you know, she said to me, you know, ain't no one taking my vote away this year, and I'll do whatever I have to do. And she felt really strongly about it, you know, and she was a DC resident, so her vote matters as little as mine. But I just thought that the intensity of the feeling was really interesting and really different from stuff that I've heard in the past. And, you know, I wouldn't mention it except that it is representative of actually what you're seeing in a lot of poll data, which is that people express the desire to vote more strongly right now than they have in the past.
Yeah, I think that's all.
Alice.
Oh, you unmuted.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead while I bring Alice on. Finish your point.
No, I think that's all important. I will just tell you my own little voting anecdote from this election season, which is that we ordered in my household absentee ballots for our Connecticut primary in August. And the applications came and we returned them, or so we thought. And it turned out my husband and my son, quite informed voters, had folded the ballot wrong. And so they had sent it back with our address in the little clear window instead of the Registrar of Voters, right? Like, do you know what I mean? So it was like one piece of paper, and if you folded it, yes, I had folded it correctly. That's like a miracle. They had not. And so what happened? They got returned to our house. And I was like, uh-oh. Like, that was a really poorly designed ballot. But, like, that's what the state of Connecticut sent. And that made me worried.
Yep.
Alice, the floor is yours.
Okay. So I volunteered so I'm in Massachusetts, and I volunteered with the primary. That was a few weeks ago. And at the end of the night, after we'd been checking, you know, what I was told was a lot fewer people than normally come through off this big list, we got a pile of ballots that were everyone in our district who had mailed something in. And to me, so we counted them the same night, and it really was no problem. So to me, it makes a lot of sense that you could pre-sort, but not necessarily pre-count mail-in votes. But there are places where you can't even sort them, and I was wondering what the justification is, if anyone has more information on that than I do.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think the history of the...
Oh, I just meant to dismiss Alice, and I dismissed Emily by mistake. Let me bring her back to answer the question. Sorry, Emily.
And I'm muted. There we go. Hi. Sorry, Alice. I think that's
Alice
a really
Alice
important
is
question.
Here. Emily is not. The person who should be answering the question is gone. The person who asked the question is still here. I'm just going to talk in a stream until Emily shows back up.
I'm here, Ben.
You can talk. Do you have an answer to this question?
Well, I'm just kind of curious as to, like, it's not clear to me how, like, even the sorting works. So that's, sorting vis-a-vis counting. Like, I was going to ask Alice a follow-up, but you dismissed Alice now. So,
now I've dismissed everybody. I just wanted to say, I did warn you that my reign of incompetence this day is
it's true.
unrivaled.
That is actually kind of
true. I started the episode with that. I did not mean to remove our guest. Emily does not seem to be coming back properly. Where did you go, Emily Bazelon?
She's in the chat box. You put her in the box where she can only communicate with us by text. This would be like Eliezer Yudikowsky would like.
This is
yes.
This is kind of embarrassing.
This is kind of this is par for your day, Ben. It's okay.
This is it is my day.
At least Emily is safely in her. At least Emily is safely in her office and not waiting for you in the rain outside a coffee shop.
It's true. I mean, Emily. That. Oh wait, is she back?
No, she said, "Kate, you can read my answer," but I don't know where her answer is.
It's higher up in the people stop.
Oh, okay.
Wait.
You can't yell at people to stop texting. Don't censor everyone. And you've already censored Emily.
I'm not censoring anybody. I'm except Emily. All right, I am.
She said,
really
"I think the history of those laws is it okay? Well, bring her in. Oh, there she is. Thank God. I think the history of these laws is about preventing fraud, which doesn't mean we should keep them in place." Emily, why didn't you follow up on your own answer?
Yeah, you're in good company. I once censored my mother by accident on In Lieu of Fun.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. The only person.
Totally. So I don't want to convey the message that mail-in balloting is associated with widespread fraud. That is not the case. However, there have been instances of fraud with absentee balloting, mostly in very small elections where you can actually throw an election if you toss a couple of bags of votes, right? Like, it only makes sense to interfere if it's going to have some impact. And I think the history of those laws is that they were trying to prevent fraud. Like, if you had to keep the ballots sealed until election day, you could make sure that you had everybody in the elections office gathered to see you open them, as opposed to people opening them secretly and then throwing them away. But that doesn't mean we should keep these laws in place because, look, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, up until 2020, have only had 2 to 3% of their electorate vote absentee in a major election. Like, they've just never done this in a big way before. And part of what went wrong in the Wisconsin primary in April, which was a total disaster of it, really like disenfranchised thousands of people, was that like they had this huge increase in volume. And so we need the states to adjust their laws to take into account that new volume. And when you talk to the secretaries of state in the states that have done tons of mail-in balloting for years now, and I'm talking about Oregon, Washington, Colorado, and Utah, they tell you, like, it's not rocket science, but it's to, like you said, Kate, to do it as an experiment in a hugely consequential election with tens of millions of ballots, like, that's a heavy lift. Like, things gonna go wrong.
I just don't even know how you end up but I just don't even know how you end up like checking yourself and creating transparency so that people I just still feel like 2000 is a very contentious election. Like even that, like, I mean, I like, you know, I look back and like, oh my God, the hanging Chad. I was making a joke the other day that like, there's no one going to be named Karen in like the next 10 years. And like, but also I was like, I bet from 2000 on, no one was named Chad. I think that's like,
you know,
the same.
And everybody named Chad had like execution jokes associated with him.
Yeah.
Ann K, the floor is yours.
Hello, can you hear me?
Ann?
I'm gonna get a new computer. Can you hear me?
We
Yep,
can't
I
hear
can
you.
hear you.
Emily?
Oh, I
Ben,
can't.
you're on a delay.
I'm on a delay.
No,
Okay, sorry.
you're fine with us. Ben is on a delay. Go ahead and ask your question.
I'm gonna get a new computer too, by the way, so then I won't be using my phone. Emily, I love listening to you on Political Gabfest and on In Lieu of Fun. And here's my question. So we had this little news with Ted Cruz today. Are you aware of that? This is, oh, you don't have to be. So
Tell me.
Trump floated 20 names for the Supreme Court. Among them was Ted Cruz. Anyway, that then got Twitter and everybody all, you know, riled up. And the idea was, oh, darn it, the Democrats still don't care about the court or courts, and they'll never vote on this issue. And Trump's, you know, ginning up his base again on judicial matters. There's a Pew poll, though, as someone pointed out, that shows Democratic voters are beginning to care more. And I was just curious whether you thought that reflected reality, and why is it, do you think, if it is true, which it probably is, a temporary blip because the court has gotten so much attention, Kavanaugh, Gorsuch, you know, or do you think there's more concern actually about the judiciary?
I mean, I've seen some polling that the courts are resonating more with liberals than they have in the past, and I think it's kind of like what Ben was just talking about. If you take something precious away or you threaten to take it away from people, then they become less complacent about it. And I think liberals have had enough victories in the Supreme Court in cases like involving, you know, marriage equality and certain other issues, little bit of the death penalty, like social issues, that they've been happy enough. And now I think that the Kavanaugh hearing in particular, and also Neil Gorsuch's confirmation, made people realize that actually the court is moving to the right in a way that could have these profound and long-term consequences. I have a question for Ben and Kate. So when Trump released his list of Supreme Court names, I saw a lot of tutting on Twitter from law professors like, oh, this is so gauche. Only a former reality star would do this. I don't see what's wrong with this. Like, why doesn't Biden release a list of names? Like, it brings, like, I feel like this is one of those, like, we just sort of decide that since Trump did it, it's bad, but I don't really get why it's bad.
I completely agree with that. I think that there is a lot to be said for the fact that, like, I think that there is a weird elitism and mystery around around the nominee list, that like if you're in the legal world, you understand who the people are on the short list and you're the expert that CNN calls in to talk about it. I actually think it's great that there is like a little bit of transparency about it. I don't think that is like Donald Trump waking up this morning in his bed and being like, you know what, I'm going to bring some transparency into the Supreme Court nomination process. I think that, nor do I actually think that that's what's like going on with the people who ended up kind of pushing for it. But I do think that is kind of that is the secondary effect of kind of what he's doing. I mean, he's obviously doing it for political purposes, and that's the gauche thing that I think that people are reacting to, is that you're trotting out types of like, here's who you'll get an abortion if you elect me. And I think that is the gauche thing that like law professors are kind of reacting to. Does that make sense, Emily?
Yeah, I guess I just still feel like it's if it's politically smart for Trump to do, maybe it's just politically smart. I felt this way about the primetime announcement of at least Gorsuch's nomination, where everyone thought that was like, but I was like, what's wrong with this? Like, we're bringing more attention to this really august institution that nobody understands, and that these people are not recognizable because they refuse to televise their own Supreme Court appearances, which I think is bad. I don't know. It just seems like, yes, I agree that it politicizes the court more. That's true. But the court is politicized.
Politicized. I agree
but
with that.
I think there's another factor going on here. So, look, conservatives have an extremely specific set of things that they want and expect from the courts. So if you release a list of 10 judges whom you say you would elevate, and it's been vetted by the Federalist Society or even proposed by the Federalist Society or the Heritage Foundation folks, there is a system by which that trickles down to a gazillion institutions that he's going to give us what we want on this stuff. And liberals have a much less precise sense of what it is they want, both methodologically and in terms of, individual specific outcomes. And so if you say, okay, I would elevate Sri Srinivasan, and I would put Marty Lederman on the Supreme Court, and I would, elevate David Barron and Diane Woods. That'll be attractive to some people and upsetting to other people, and you will not have the same resonance that you get in a conservative world that is much more, at least philosophically, I wouldn't say monochrome, because it's not monochrome, but there are certain bedrock things that they've all agreed to agree about. And so I think, I honestly think the issue is less gaucheness, though I do think it's gauche, than it is just that it wouldn't work for liberals. It wouldn't, if you released a list of liberals who you would choose from this list, some people would criticize the list for not being diverse enough. Some people would criticize the list for not being liberal enough. Some people would criticize the list for being, too X or too Y, because there isn't the set of, there's no similar thing that you can say to, we believe in deciding cases based on the original understanding and the original public meaning of the law. Leave aside whether whether that's even a meaningful thing to say. People really believe it means something, and that makes a difference.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm trying to decide if I agree. I mean, for conservatives, I think that overturning Roe versus Wade is the number one, and then there are priorities on guns and on dialing back, civil rights protections and affirmative action. You don't think that liberals have a kind of wish list that goes in a different direction that has to do with expanding the protections of, equal protection under the law and due process? And
well, don't you think that we went through a period of, I think that we went through a period in the, I don't know when you would actually start it, because this is not my bailiwick, obviously, but from the civil rights era onwards, of kind of very expansive social rights being recognized by the Supreme Court, and since then those being slowly chipped away until you got to kind of the era of same-sex marriage. I would say that same-sex marriage was the only thing in recent memory that I can see on the wish list of liberals. That I remember people talking about how someone would vote for something besides Roe v. Wade. That it was they will vote for same-sex marriage.
But Roe v. Wade is an example of something you would not do, not something you would do, because it's already been decided, right? So I would preserve it. That's not a legal agenda.
No. But I mean, when I'm talking about liberals talking about the court period, whether it's yes, yes, you're completely correct, Ben. Like conservatives want to want a proactive like to overturn Roe v. Wade or take it away. Whereas like, I guess what I'm saying is like liberals want to strengthen it or have it maintain the status quo. And then the only thing that I can remember that they've wanted like an advancement on was same-sex marriage in recent memory. Right? Like, I don't think like.
Before we run out of time, though, I want to ask Emily about her article that's coming out tomorrow.
Oh, all right. I'm putting my other
Emily,
answers into the chat, and we can move along to that.
You're very good at
this.
You
have an article coming out in the New York Times Magazine tomorrow. It is not on the election meltdown or the future of the Supreme Court or any of these things. It is on what we lose when we don't go back to school. So tell us about, give us a little preview.
Yeah, so I'm kind of obsessed with this right now because I feel like we're not paying enough attention to the loss of in-person school as a country, and the costs that we're asking kids to bear for preventing the spread of coronavirus. Obviously, I'm all for preventing the spread of coronavirus, but I feel like we are under-attending to what Zoom school is doing to our kids. So we convened for the magazine a panel of experts on education to talk about what we already know about the losses of learning from the spring and what's likely to happen if kids stay in this extended limbo. And it's really bleak. And I think one of the reasons I am so troubled by this is that in my own city, even though our rate of coronavirus is very low, we're at about 3.5 per 100,000, and it's been very low all summer, my city's Board of Education chose not to open our schools. And I'm watching my own kid deal with that, and I'm thinking about the thousands of kids in New Haven and elsewhere who are not logging on at all, who are not connected, and the many more kids who are just having a really hard time fully engaging. Because I think that for a lot of school districts, there was not enough preparation. Teachers essentially are being asked to do their job, like I think of it as being asked to do their jobs with their hands tied behind their backs. And I think this is not like it's not a death count. It's not like a very visible cost of the pandemic, but it's going to be with us for a long time. And I'm really, really worried about it. And I honestly feel like I have learned about myself in the pandemic that I just feel like kids are incredibly central and should always come first. And they're just really not. Like seeing cities open indoor dining instead of schools shocks me. And you can attribute a lot of this to the failed federal response. I totally get it. But I also feel like I'm watching blue states and blue cities make choices that really trouble me.
So one of the things I've been interested in from watching Israel and Israel's pandemic response, which was spectacular in the
until
first
it wasn't
wave, and an unmitigated disaster in the second wave. I mean, they really did a good job, to the point that, you know, I had to have some uncomfortable conversations about Bibi Netanyahu. Yeah, you know, I don't like the guy, but he really did a good job managing this. And then the big problem that they raised is that they open the schools, and large numbers of kids go to school, and they're congratulating themselves that they, they've reopened in a fashion that's robust, and all of a sudden their numbers look like ours.
So have you read about that whole thing in detail, though? Because I have, so I'm going to talk for a minute.
Please correct me.
Throw it down.
No, you're
tell
right.
Me that I'm, tell me that that is not a story about whatever you do not open the schools.
It's not a story about that, and here's why. What Israel did, so they thought they flattened the curve and they thought they had beat coronavirus. And so there's a day, I think it's the day Netanyahu reforms his coalition, where he's like, we're reopening everything, go to the beach, have a drink, be careful, but it's all good. They started having weddings, funerals, everything. And yes, they opened the schools. Now, when they only opened preschools carefully and when they had kids in small groups in elementary school, they were fine. Then they just threw open the doors to the high schools. They didn't have social distancing required. They had 35 kids in a class. And then in a few high schools, including this gymnasia in Rochavia in Jerusalem, where there was a serious outbreak, it was super hot out. And the kids were sitting with the windows open and masks on. And the parents said, this is inhumane. We don't have coronavirus anymore. We need to shut the windows and turn the air conditioning on. And that's when there were hundreds of cases. So to me, that is a story not about you can't reopen. It's about reopening wrong. And we're seeing this is, colleges and universities are not the same as elementary schools because they're residential, but we're seeing a similar problem right now in the United States. We're having big outbreaks at universities that are not rigorously testing and taking other important precautions and having everything set up right for quarantine, et cetera, et cetera. And then we're having a lot of schools where like everything's okay so far because they did it right. So I feel like it's really important to remember that the Israel example is specific. And also there are all these other schools in European countries and in Canada that have had in-person learning successfully. And to see the data comprehensively, we tend to over-focus on the terrible outbreaks. And like, I get it, they're newsworthy. But when you look at the whole picture, it's different.
So
That's actually
this is kind
really
of
reassuring.
You should, like go-to people on this are Emily Oster at Brown as an economist and Zeynep Tufekci at UNC as a sociologist. Like they always
Both
make
amazing.
me feel, yes. And also other people, Scott Gottlieb.
Emily in particular is like, Dana Goldstein has been amazing, but she's on maternity leave right now.
Which is like a terrible loss for everybody. I mean, God bless.
I know. She went to Brown with me.
But it's bad. Yeah, she's awesome. I love her.
She's awesome.
And Erica Green is also out right now, another great education reporter at the Times. It's really too bad. I mean, God, of course, anyway. They deserve their leaves, but man, I miss them.
I think that there's like a lot falling on your shoulders at the moment. But like, just to kind of like bring this to like, so what I think I'm hearing, so here's what I read your PDF, the PDF that you sent me ahead of this of like what the article is going to be tomorrow. It's fantastic. It is a series of interviews with people around the United States that are doing reopening of schools in various types of ways and what it actually looks like. The New York Times has been experimenting with a lot of different ways of storytelling, and I think that a lot of them are really beautiful and very, very smart and compelling. So this is one of them. And I just kind of wanted to, I was like scrolling through all the pictures because the pictures was like a huge part of your story. I felt like
totally, which I get huge part. Yes.
Yeah, and like that. This is one of the reasons I like the Times' new way of doing things. Is they like kind of like really can like they really wed the two together in a way that like is powerful, and you understand what's happening in the pictures in a way. But what I wanted to say is like, this is exactly what I'm talking about. This is like, there are, as you just described, ways of doing it smartly and safely, yet they're not replicating themselves because the norms are not such that they have spread widely to all of these different bodies of people. And so everyone is just, so let's put it like, I don't know, in my mind, it's like norms slowly become standardization, slowly become laws or like rules, right? And like that's kind of the progression. And like there's no norms yet around what exactly the safe procedures are and like what works and what doesn't. And so people are still experimenting and playing with things. And there is like everyone's making it up for themselves. And eventually it's going to be, I think, hopefully, like everyone just wears a freaking mask all the time and no one is like, like that we understand that is the norm. But like, 6 months ago, that was not what people were talking about. And so the other thing I want to kind of ask you a quick question on is for high school students, for middle school students, I think actually I was just like talking to one of my friends with young kids in like middle school, and she was saying what a loss it was that they weren't back in school. Because if we think that we have a hard time not socializing with people, they are completely like at a loss. And so much of their learning of social life and the world in general comes from their peers when they're in school. Like, do you think that that's able to replicate in these social distanced environments? 2, do you think the social distanced environments are better than the online environments? 3, do you think that the online environments create new risks? You've written a lot about this with bullying and everything else. Or like 4, do you think that like all of whatever social costs it might have to children to not have that type of that type of development, that it's worth it to keep them isolated in some sense from the rest of the population?
Those are such good questions. I mean, I think that wherever we can de-isolate the kids and get them off the screens, we should. Now, that doesn't mean that like I'm in favor of some unsafe, like don't misunderstand, but I think that small gatherings of teenagers, especially outside in places where coronavirus is not rampant, are actually really important, and we should be making more opportunities for them. So I was actually on the phone this morning with the principal at my kid's high school saying, like, could we plan some event for the ninth graders? Like, my kid's not in ninth grade, but like when he was coming to the school for the first time and didn't know anyone, it's kind of nuts to start like that, and they haven't met any of the teachers. And she was actually jumping at that possibility. Now, like, we're going to have to plan it really carefully. I don't know how it's like, it's all, the devil is totally in the details, but I have tried so hard not to cut my kids off. If I lived in Florida or a place where over the summer there was a lot of coronavirus, I would have definitely taken more precautions. But I guess I feel like we all have risk budgets with coronavirus, and I want to spend my whole risk budget on children. And like,
risk
we're not.
Budget is such a great term. Is that like a term you invented? That's a great term.
No, I don't think so.
Risk budget is a great, okay, well, anyways, but that's like, I think that is what an amazing, like, yeah, and I think it really depends because, like, right, if you also are simultaneously like taking care of elderly parents, like, or something like that, it completely changes your environment. It completely changes it. And so, yeah, and I mean, it also just changes it. Like, I was kind of lamenting to someone how this has changed my like entire career in terms of when I was thinking of going up for tenure or what I was thinking of doing and everything else. And then I kind of had a talk with like an older colleague, much older, who is retired and who had had moved to San Francisco specifically to write a book about technology and like to live like the next 10 to 15 years of his life out in San Francisco. And he's like, why am I here? Like, I could be doing all of these from Italy. Like all of these like kind of interviews from Italy, I don't know why I'm here. And I think that's kind of an interesting question. Like, I do think that like we think of it as a lost year, but for some of us, the loss is more fungible than for others. And for kids, totally. I think that's like especially true. And for the elderly, I think that's very, very true.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. I think you're right. I mean, the other thing I was thinking when you were talking about yourself is like people who are at threshold moments in their lives, like liminal moments. That's also a really big thing. Like my life is very, what?
Like having kids? Like, I'm
like
deciding
on a job.
Orange today. Like, let's have children. Like,
totally. Or like, should I take this job in this other city? Or like, should I go into the Peace Corps? Like, so should I go to this college and not that college? All that kind of stuff. All the people whose lives are actually like moving around.
Yeah, totally. Emily, it has been so fun having you. Please
so
come
much
back.
Fun.
Thank you. I had a great time talking to you guys, as I knew I would, and I'm totally happy to come back. So just ask me.
Yeah.
So,
this
Kate,
is wonderful.
Who do we have for tomorrow?
Ooh, you have a
Ben
good pick for tomorrow. Say it again, because I just interrupted you. Sorry.
Oh, Ben Smith. Ben Smith from the New York. I guess it was like a New York Times week. We had Jamelle Bouie, we had Emily Bazelon, we had now we have Ben Smith to close it out. It'll be really fun. I am so excited to talk to Ben. He had a fascinating column this week, and it'll be great. And we can talk to him about we can poke him about Andrew Sullivan, so that'll be fun too.
Yeah, we poked Jamelle about Andrew Sullivan, and now we can poke Ben Smith about Andrew Sullivan.
Exactly.
And all of that will happen 22 hours and 54 minutes from now. And until then, Kate, what do we say? I think it is your turn.
I know it is my turn. We don't have fun anymore, but in lieu of fun, we have voting in person, absentee ballots, in-person school, out-of-person school, virtual school, and no school at all.
Who could ask for more?
Okay.
Emily Bazelon, you're a great American. Thanks for joining us. We'll
Thank
see
you
you
for
all
having me,
tomorrow.
Ben and Kate.
I hope we never have a Canadian on and you say that to them, by the way.
They're American.
They're Americans too.
They're lucky.
It's really when we have another when Thomas Ilves joins us again, we have an Estonian
They have
on, and we call him a
schools.
great American. They do.
They have schools.
We will see you soon.
Bye, guys.
Bye, guys.